Hey, what's up family? Casanova here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all 5 things that I wish that I knew when I first got started investing into real estate. Now, when we get our first property, we get so excited. We're thinking about the tenant, we're thinking about the cash flow, but we never stop to think about what are all the pitfalls or the obstacles that we can run into, the challenges that we can run into. I know on my first couple deals, I made a lot of money, but I learned a lot more because of the mistakes that I made. So I want to share with you those mistakes that I made, some tips on what I wish that I would have known, in hopes that this will be able to help speed up your learning curve. At the same time, it will be able to help you avoid the pitfalls of where I lost and where a lot of investors lose. So we'll jump right into it. Number 1, I wish that I would have known about screening tenants. Now, what's so important about screening tenants? We all know that we should be doing some type of a credit app, a background check on our properties, but we don't know to the level of what we should be doing it. I always like to screen all my tenants now because I want to check references. I want to know when they first got started renting property, were they a good tenant at the time and now they're a great tenant as well? Or when they first got started, were they great, but now over the last 1 to 2 to 3 years, they've had a couple evictions. The references that check out for them don't verify for them. And what I mean by that is that person going to say, yep, they're a hardworking person. They're going to make sure that they pay all of their bills on time, because now you become one of their bills, that they always make sure that they have their bills on time. They're going to work all the time. They have been a credible person. So I always want to know that. The second thing I want to know is what type of an income are they bringing in? And what do I mean by that? We normally want to make sure as an investor that our tenant is able to bring in gross 2.5 to 3 times the monthly rent that we're asking them to pay. If they're not making that type of a money, you can imagine that they're probably going to fall short some type of months, or some, couple months in a row. And who has to pick up the burden on that? It's going to be you. So I make sure that now that they are bringing in the type of money that I'm asking them to bring in, which is 2.5 to 3 times the month or the rent. Number 3, I want to make sure that their employment checks out. So what do I mean by that? I want to make sure that they've had this job and they've had stability in their job. If they're just transitioning jobs, I get it. We all find a new career at some point in our life. But I want to make sure off of the last job, was that someone that you could depend on? Because I need to be able to depend on them to protect my investment and to make their payments over time. So if their boss, if their colleagues won't vouch for them, then I can't have them into my property, because what's going to happen is that it's going to become a headache, and then down the road you're going to have more problems for themselves. So I want to make sure that, number 1, I screen my tenants. Number 2, I want to make sure that the lease is in my favor. What do I mean by that? When we first have any tenant sign a lease agreement, we want to make sure that everything is spelled out and that it's in our favor. One of the things that I'm very proud of that I learned to do is that anything under $50, I tell the tenant up front before they sign the lease that this will be your responsibility. How does this help me? This helps me to be able to make sure that anytime they have a clogged up toilet, or if they have a light bulb, or if they need a furnace filter change, that they're not calling me at 11 p.m. at night or 4 a.m. in the morning if it's something minor. Now, of course, if it's a major issue, if we're talking about any type of a broken window, if we're talking about, the furnace is shut off, if we're talking about the roof's leaking, then yes, I want to know all of that so I can get my contractor, or I can get someone over there to take a look, and then also to make the repairs in a timely manner, which is ASAP. But any small things, the reason why a lot of people don't like to be landlords is because they don't like to be bogged down by little nitpicky things. This right here is one of the ways that you make sure that you protect it in your favor, because there's a lot of landlord-tenant laws out there. And a lot of laws, just in general, are meant to protect the public, or potentially protect anyone who could be looked up as a victim. Right? So you as a landlord, you have to make sure that you have an attorney look over your lease agreement in the beginning. If you can, you definitely want to make sure that. And then the second thing is that you spell out everything and you have a lot of things in your favor. Another thing that I do is, as long as I give them a 24-hour notice, I go check on the property for no reason at all. right? So this is at my discretion. Of course, I'm not looking to be bogging down my tenants. I'm not looking to just be popping up. I don't want to micromanage anyone. They're grown. They're paying their own rent. I want to let them have their peace and their freedom. But if I feel like that there's something that could be detrimental to my property or to the neighborhood, I want to make sure that I have that clause in there that, hey, I'm going to pop by. I'm going to check out the property. And this ensures that everything is up to standards and codes of what we already discussed in the lease anyway. So what I mean by that, if there's a animal on the property, I want to make sure that I knew this up front, right? Especially a dog or something, depending on the type of a dog, right? There's all these things that I want to make sure that we laid out in the beginning, so I communicated and I was transparent about that, and that they're following it because I have to protect my investment. Now, my third tip is to make sure that we understand the repairs and the renovations. Now, why are these so important? Is because you have to understand when you're rehabbing your property in the beginning, there's going to be some type of tenants that wreck your property. So you got to see, are you putting in carpet? If you're putting in carpet, do you expect to replace it within 12 to 24 months? That's going to be probably a $2,000 expense if you don't have a tenant that's going to be there potentially for 2, 3, 4 years, right? Or are you going to put in tile, which has a little bit more durability? Nowadays, you can do luxury vinyl tile, something like that, or you can have hardwood. If you have hardwood, of course, that's going to have less upkeep and wear and tear, but at the same time, you do have to refinish them, particularly, in a couple years or maybe even 5 years down the road. So all I'm saying is make sure that we account for that we're thinking about it. Same thing is, if we are bringing in $400 of cash flow every single month, and then after 1 year, if your furnace is old, it costs you another $6,000 to get a new furnace. Now you've brought in $4,800 of cash flow, but if you didn't have any other reserves, now that cash flow has to go towards you getting a new furnace. So now if it costs $6,000, let's say $6,000 for the furnace, but you've only brought in $4,800, right? So now you're at $1,200 in the hole. You're now $1,200 in the hole. Whereas if you would have been budgeting for that every single month, right? We have other things called CapEx, which is potentially a new roof if you know your roof is old. We have, windows, you have appliances, all these things you just want to make sure that you account for in the beginning. Because if you never think about them, I can promise you they will come up. And when it comes up, if you have no reserves, you're going to be in trouble. So that's number 3, making sure that we account for the repairs and even the potential renovations once this tenant moves out. Number 4 is going to be insurance. Why is insurance so important? I'll tell you all the story. When we first got one of our first Airbnbs, it was a condo, but it was set up like a townhome, right? And what wound up happening was we didn't own the roof in that property. So what was a big deal about that? Well, the tenant behind us, they wound up getting water in front of their driveway, which trickled down and came into our unit. Well, when I went to file an insurance claim on it, the adjuster came out. He says, okay, where's your tenant? I said, we have guests that are coming here in the next couple days, so we need to get this figured out. He says, oh, you're doing a short-term rental. I say, yeah, we've been Airbnb-ing it. And he goes back to the insurance company, right? Not my agent, but the insurance company tells them that. I get a call a couple days later. They say that they're not looking to pay out my claim because even though I had a landlord policy, which I thought was all I needed, that does not cover short-term rentals. And then on top of that, it doesn't cover surface water damage. So what that means is because I didn't have any leaky pipes that came into my unit, or it wasn't my roof or something that was leaking, that they didn't want to cover it. So they wound up not paying out the claim. And then on top of that, because I was doing short-term rentals and they didn't want anything to do with that, they dropped me from the policy. Now this wasn't my fault because this was my 4th property, right? 3rd Airbnb, and I had communicated all of this. But my agent didn't know that we were specifically doing an Airbnb on this one. And when I called him up and just told him I needed another the policy because I had another rental. He never said anything, and then what wound up happening was on the back end, we wound up taking a loss, and it wound up costing me about probably $4,000 to $5,000 all in all because of the renovation work that I had to put back into the property, and then keeping the property off of the market while I was fighting with the insurance company. So the way that you can avoid this is to make sure that up front you communicate with your agent what's going to be your strategy. Are you buying and holding it for a long term? Are you doing Airbnb? Or are you flipping it so you just need a short-term policy? Either way, you'll need an insurance policy. Just make sure that you have the right type of policy. Another thing is you want to make sure that if there was by chance a fire, that you have the right type of coverage. Don't go cheap on your coverage and only get, $60,000 worth of coverage, whereas if you had to rebuild that property, it's going to cost $100,000 to $125,000. Being gracious, and now you're out because now they're only going to fill your claim up to $60,000. So again, just make sure that you communicate with your insurance agent. I can't stress that enough. And the fifth thing is to make sure you understand how the eviction process works. That is very, very important as well. Why is that important? Is because even though you think that you're going to get the best tenant because you've done all these nice renovations, the reality of it is that's not the case. So you got to make sure that you understand the eviction policy and the eviction process. Because I thought in the beginning when I was going to have to evict, I thought that it was a 2 to 3 day process. I could just tell them to get their stuff, get out, right? They weren't abiding by my rules, the terms and agreements of the contract. But I found that that was not the case. Right? And many of my clients, they also find out that this is not the case. There's laws. You have to make sure that you are not being sued because of discrimination, because you have to make sure that you talk to an attorney and that you're following all the rules, all the regulations by law before you evict them. And this can be a 60 to 90 day process before they're out. On top of that, have they been vandalizing your property in the meantime? What I mean by that is they just haven't been keeping up with it. They know that they're being evicted. If the dog that they have is not, just chewing up the walls, or if they're writing on the walls, or if they're not, changing out the furnace filter, or if they're just not having the upkeep, you got to make sure that you protect yourself and you protect your investment. But the only way that you can really do that is by knowing what the laws and the regulations are, and making sure that you consult with an attorney, because you don't want to be sued on the back end on top of losing all this money. Because make no mistake about it, when you have to file those fees and pay an attorney, it's going to take time, and you could potentially lose out on all that money. And even if you're taking this tenant to potentially small claims court, it's going to be a while before you get that back, if you ever even get that back. So just make sure that you protect yourself and that you understand the eviction process as well. So number one, you have to make sure that you screen your tenants, right? Make sure that you know the income, you verify. Do they have a felony? Does it align, with what your views, your values are? Was it a one-time, one-off situation? Or is it something that really, hits heart with you and it doesn't align with your vision? Don't put yourself at risk. Don't put your community at risk, right? Just make sure. I'm not saying that people do not need and deserve second chances, but what I am saying is just make sure that you do your due diligence. Number two, make sure you have a lease and that it's in your favor. Make sure you understand that and that your tenants understand that. Who's going to cover snow removal? Who's going to have the upkeep of gardening? Who's going to put the trash out? Who's going to cover a lot of these different things? Furnace filters, plunging toilets. All these things will come up. You must run your business like a business. Number three, repairs and renovations. Have a number up front, right? You don't have to know everything, but at least have a ballpark range of where you're going to be. Number four, insurance. Make sure you have a good insurance agent, right, that knows that this is a rental property. Here's what I'm going to do with it. Do I have sewer coverage with this if something was to back up? Right? What type of a coverage do I have? If I was to rebuild this property in case of an emergency, would I be covered on that? And number five, I understand the eviction process. I understand the laws that come behind that, and I'm making sure that I'm not being, vindictive, and at the same time, I make sure that I'm being fair, but at the same time, I really make sure that I'm just operating within the laws. So that's my tips for you all. Hopefully you got something out of this. As always, if you did, leave something in the comments. Let me know. Am I full of it? Have you had to encounter with any of these, or anybody that you know have had? And like it, share it. comment. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this. I want to try to help as many people as possible. I know this is the way that I help a lot of my clients, and I want to bring the same value to you all as well. It's Casanova signing out. Remember, in the dream we trust, but we have to make sure that we take action. Otherwise, it'll only merely be a fantasy. We'll talk soon.